In 1997, Final Fantasy VII was released, a seminal title which would go on to become the best-selling Final Fantasy game of all time, something which has still not been surpassed, in terms of the single-player entries, selling more than 10 million copies. Its impact pushed the popularity of Japanese-based RPGs in the West, encouraging the porting of the older games that didn't come originally, and setting the PS1 up as the home of the JRPG. The game's influence is extremely well documented. In fact, it is so acclaimed that it has reached that venerable position of its success attracting a group of people who are determined to tell you it's massively overrated and bang average. Truly the greatest honour any game can receive. But probably the most important thing about it is how it overshadowed the games the owners of the platform that made it famous had created themselves. Released in 1996, Wild Arms was an attempt by Sony to create an in-house JRPG for the PlayStation. Notably, they specifically wanted it to be 3D. Now, this may seem like something pretty standard now, but the notion of a 3D RPG was pretty daunting at the time, generally given the scale and size of the RPGs. The expression of a 3D overworld as we saw in Final Fantasy VII and beyond was really not something seen at this point. It was never really a written or confirmed policy, but Sony USA had a pretty strong no RPG attitude due to their association with being 2D, and the company wanting to push 3D games. Wild Arms itself would only get a US release in 1998, after the company eventually eased their stance on the matter, genuinely believed to be swayed by the success of Final Fantasy VII. So let's look if the game was truly a victim of circumstance, or if it's just generally average. It's a JRPG basically. You toddle around towns and talk to people. You then travel across the world map to arrive at other towns to toddle around and talk to people. Or you arrive at the dungeon and engage the beasties in turn-based combat. So yes, the pretty standard JRPG to be fair. But that would actually be unfair to throw into this game because it does actually do some interesting things as well. Starting with the combat. As I said, it is really the turn-based combat synonymous with the 90s, but with one or two things to try and differentiate it. First, the interface, which is always an interesting experience with JRPGs of this time. Since they generally used to be turn-based, the gameplay wouldn't be radically different. So as a result, the interfaces needed to be a bit more varied to attempt to differentiate the various games. In this case, we have party member health on the top right, moving to the bottom of the screen during animations, and enemy information in the bottom left. In the center we have commands with a two-layered input. And the commands are actually quite interesting for the time of release. On the first menu, we can choose whether to run from battle, the order you want to choose your character's attacks. They will still attack in terms of their initiative, so even if you arrange that this character goes first, they will still only attack based on their initiative, but you will still be able to choose which one first. Next, we have the option to set the party to automated AI mode. This video is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends, setting them to either defend, attack, support, etc. And at the top we have a feature which isn't really that prevalent in RPGs anymore, and I'd actually like to see come back. The ability to change equipment in battle. Now it really isn't that important in this game, since mostly it's just this equipment is clearly better than the other. A feature a moron like myself appreciates. I'm generally not a fan of having to fine tweak per big encounter. But it's still a great feature, and it's pretty absent lately. You don't know what you're going to fight coming up, you don't know what the kind of creatures will be and what their weaknesses are, so why should I not be able to alter my equipment to counteract them? You can make it take time and punish you for doing it, but I don't see why you can't be allowed to react to the situation. And don't come tell me it's more realistic that way. In reality, people don't take turns to twat each other. Anyway, by selecting the center option, quick diversion, it's a little annoying that you can't just push the appropriate direction to select the option. If you don't hold down the direction button, it moves back to the center. But if you do select the center button, it will take you to the character's command list. We of course have the standard attack, defend and use item, which is available to all three characters, but it becomes a bit more unique when it comes to the last two. So we'll talk about the specific characters here. But first just a quick run through of what they are. Number 1, abilities. Pretty standard for RPGs, each character has abilities unique to them, just like the class/job based combat systems. Number 2, forces, a bit more complicated. Each character has 4 force abilities, some which are unlocked via story progression and others from doing side activities. And the way they work in combat is actually pretty interesting. The characters have 4 force levels. In order to be able to use their force abilities, they need to be on its specific level. Once you use one of the abilities, it'll drop the force level. In order to raise the force level, you just need to fight. Get hit, hit something else, just stand there. As long as the battle continues, the force level will rise. Similar-ish to the limit break system a certain game the next year would feature, but with the key distinction that the force level resets to 0 at the end of each battle. And on the whole, I actually really like the system. It manages the more overpowered abilities pretty well. You can't use them from the beginning of battle, but should the battle rage on for some time, you'll have access to them pretty readily. Especially since what I stated earlier might have given a bit of an inaccurate view. Gaining and dropping force levels isn't just a segmented 1, 2, 3, 4 situation. You have a force bar, which is what actually fills up, and likewise what gets used up when you're using the abilities. The higher level the ability, the more of the bar it will use. And so because of this, you can decide whether to just use a level 4 ability, or use multiple level 1 abilities, or a mixture of 2, 3, 1, whatever like that. So it's actually well designed that in a long battle, specifically boss battles, you will regularly have access to your force abilities, but won't be able to just spam them relentlessly. However, this does of course kind of rely on the abilities actually being good, so let's take a look at that in a more personal detail. But first I do think we have to talk about one ability that actually is common across the characters. The second force ability that gets unlocked relatively early in the story, they're basically the summons from Final Fantasy. I'll talk more about their story role later, but in terms of combat, they're decent. They are just big spells like in the good old days, and the escalation in damage in comparison to standard magic is pretty noticeable. Well, in some cases. Guardians are used via ruins. Each Guardian has a rune, which again you get through story events or exploration. Once you've obtained the rune, you can equip it, and it will then be able to summon said Guardian in battle. Now here's where I encountered some trouble. All 3 characters are able to summon, but only the one who had magic casting abilities, and therefore the higher sorcery stat, seemed to be doing any real damage of note, while the other 2 were quite pitiful by comparison. It isn't a massive issue though, since damage isn't the only capability of the summoned Guardians, so you can just equip them with the stat buffing ones instead. And there's also the benefit from the fact that equipping runes gives stat improvements, so you can basically just think of it as extra equipment really. So that's the common commands covered. Let's now get this more personalized. I will go into more detail with regards to the characters later on, but for now I'll go far enough to say that Rudy is one of the very few possessors of the titular arms. This was something that actually surprised me, because I kind of thought given the name and setting, everyone would be carrying them, but they're actually quite rare. So obviously because of this, his abilities are based around these arms. Firstly, his abilities. He starts with a basic handgun, but through exploration you can discover more of them. When used in battle, they serve as his version of magic, being his means of doing a large amount of damage. They even have their own version of MP in the form of bullets. Each use uses up a bullet until there are no more shots left. In order to replenish the bullets, you can either pay someone in town to do it for you, or you can use bullet clips that can be found. And this actually leads to a pretty good balance when making use of them. You can't just rapid fire relentlessly due to the limited number of bullets you have. Maybe this is why they were hesitant to release it in the US. This ties into the more negative aspect of the arms. They are upgradable, with you being able to improve the damage, chance to hit, and clip capacity. Which is actually a pretty cool feature, but the World of Fulgaia must be controlled by Lockheed Martin because these weapon upgrades are ridiculously expensive. And it's not like they're even suitably scaled. I mean, it goes from 500 to 2000 to 5000, then 10,000, then 20,000. But to be fair, the upgrades do make the arms pretty OP, so I guess that's the trade-off. We'll now move on to how the arms tie into Rudy's force abilities. His first ability is Lock-On. It basically makes sure that an attack with one of his arms won't miss when used. It's pretty good for early on, but does lose some of its usefulness later as you upgrade the arms and so improve their accuracy. But again, given the cost of the upgrades and the fact you find more arms that will need more upgrading, it never becomes redundant. Second, as mentioned, Summon Guardian. Third is Protector, basically the cover mechanic from Final Fantasy games. You can get Rudy to take damage for other characters. Given that he's the most meaty of the three, and for some reason the enemies seem to enjoy picking on the other two, it can be pretty helpful. And lastly, Fury Shot. It gives an arm attack 100% accuracy and makes it do massive damage, which is pretty good, I would say. Again, more detail later, but in summary, Jack's whole thing is being a Blade Master. His abilities are known as Quick Draw and involves him learning new techniques throughout the game. In order to learn them, he gets a hint by a conversation, witnessing an event, or for one unique ability, a specific action in combat. After getting the hint, he must then attempt to use the ability in combat, and each time will have a chance of learning the ability. And what are the abilities? Mostly damage related really, but there is one that provides healing, and he does learn the game's steal ability, which is actually good since there are some pretty good items that you can steal and aren't easy to find by the other means. But let's get on to the force abilities. Number 1, Accelerator. Using it will ensure that Jack will go first. While it sounds good, I didn't find it amazingly useful for one simple reason. Jack is really fast. A lot of the time you'll go first in combat anyway, so it's not really that necessary. But it can be helpful if you need to ensure that you're going to get healing in before an attack can happen maybe. Second, Summon Guardian. Third, Sonic Vision. It ensures that Jack goes first and it does a lot of damage. And damage are good. And lastly, Double Command. Jack gets 2 turns. Something I'm pretty sure we can agree is very disgusting in a turn-based game. Moving on to the last character, Cecilia is the magic-based character, able to learn black and white magic, and is also the most adept with the Guardians. The magic is done well. The difference in damage she does compared to her physical is noticeable, and the MP usage is not too high for commands that she will have to be using regularly. And most notable, the way that magic is learned is really unique. Throughout the game you can find crest crafts. With them you can go to the magic guild and bind them with magic. So you get to choose which spell you get each time and kind of build the kind of maid you would like. This of course does have the drawback of you not knowing what you will come up against before finding a new questcraft, but I never felt disadvantaged by that. You can also name the spells, which is pretty fun. But again, onto the forces. Firstly, Mystic. You can choose an item to awaken its properties. Depending on the item, different things will happen. It's pretty good for healing especially, since using it on restorative items, and those that cure ailments, will use it on the entire party rather than just an individual. Second, you should know by now, pay attention. Third, High Guardian. She summons a Guardian, but it is more OP when summoned. And lastly, Dual Cast. She can use 2 spells in one turn. Any JRPG veteran will know how good this ability is. It was really great that all 3 characters are truly unique. Their means of learning their abilities are completely different, and their combat styles are noticeably different as well. Most importantly, they all feel like they contribute to the battle in their own unique way. Something which honestly I didn't always feel in Final Fantasy VII. As much as I did love the materia system, it did sometimes feel like it made the characters a bit interchangeable. You could port the materia from one character to another, and they would be able to basically replicate the same role. So well done to Wild Arms for making this distinction. Though I will say in Final Fantasy VII's defense, it is easier to do this balance with only 3 characters compared to the 8 it had. But let's move on to how Wild Arms does another common RPG trope. We all know about status effects. They are pretty ubiquitous to the RPG regular. So why talk about it? Well, mostly because it's just a bit of a blast from the past, and so I wanted to be a bit nostalgic. Unlike that which became a common feature as the Final Fantasy series progressed, the status effects in Wild Arms remain after battle. And added to that, you don't have any kind of Esuna or status element removal spell early in the game. And while this can be annoying at times, it's actually good design. Because what it forces you to do is make use of the recovery items. Because status effects would disappear after battle in the later Final Fantasies, I would always end up with a pile of items that I had no use for. But now in Wild Arms you genuinely need to use them. Firstly, because again they continue off the battle, you can't just tough the battle out and be cured afterwards, and also because you don't have magic to cure it. And the other key point is the world design, which we'll obviously be getting into later. The towns are pretty far apart, not all of them even have the means to cure status effects, so you really will need to make use of items. The other interesting thing about the status effects is a nice little balancing mechanic for long battles with annoying enemies who love spamming status effects. Tying into the force levels, if the character reaches maximum force level, they can enter Condition Green, which removes all status effects from the affected character, which is a nice feature which rewards you for sticking it out and keeping yourself in the battle. So what are the different status effects? A combination of the standard, but a few interesting ones. The standard ones, of course, poison, sleep, paralysis, and confusion. What is pretty cool about the confusion though is the confused character will also just dot about aimlessly on the world map if they're still confused. The more unique ones are Bad Omen, increased encounter rate. I know this is in other games, but it's not as ubiquitous. Disease, similar to Zombie in the older Final Fantasies, characters can't be healed. However, it does have the distinction that it doesn't damage the character as well, like it does in the Final Fantasy games. Forgetfulness, the greatest crime in an RPG, the affected character won't get XP from battle until cured. And lastly, Flash. Not like Darkness/Blind as you would expect. Flash doesn't affect the party's accuracy when attacking, it affects a hidden command which I neglected to mention earlier. Another feature I quite like is that when your party is attacked, they will have a chance of counter-attacking their opponent, depending on the character's parry ability. So what Flash does is pretty much nullifies the probability of this happening. So I genuinely think status effects are done pretty well taken as a whole. Let us move on to one or two minor issues in the interest of balance. Let me start this off by saying that these are very minor issues which, while could be done better, really don't detract from the gameplay experience that much. It's actually more just a bit of an interesting insight as to a possible reason why Final Fantasy became the top dog JRPG series which took control of the mainstream. Final Fantasy just seems to have a few quality of life improvements that make it a smoother experience. Firstly, combat flow. It's a little bit of a weird one to explain, but the combat in Wild Arms just feels a little bit stodgy and stilted. Like between each attack and action there's a little bit of a brief pause which just makes the combat feel a bit slower as opposed to Final Fantasy which just flows better. Next we have the inns. As is standard for the genre, you can go to the inn to sleep and recover health, but it doesn't remove status elements. You have to go to the churches to do that. But the churches are free, so it's not even like it's an extra expense to add challenge like how Dragon Quest made you pay to revive party members. It's just an extra stroll you have to go for in the town. Then we have the area of effect attacks. Like Dragon Quest, Wild Arms lumps the enemies into formations, and so an area of effect attack will hit all enemies in a formation, which means that if you have enemies in different formations, they won't both be hit by the attack. So what becomes annoying about this is if you kill the majority of enemies, they won't blend into a new formation, so you can have two enemies but two different formations. Again, something I think Final Fantasy just streamlined a bit better with the ability to hit all the enemies, but with the trade-off of the damage being spread around about them. Next, if you target a party member to be healed and they are KO'd before you cast it, it will then just attempt to heal the corpse rather than move on to another party member. And then a very small thing, there's like no tutorial in the game. Like Final Fantasy would often have like a place you could go to which gave you a brief rundown of some of the just cool gameplay features. Then again, this was the time of manuals, and I actually looked at the manual for this game. It's quite extensive, so not really a fair criticism. And lastly, this one is pretty annoying, especially in this day and age. You can't save on the world map. You have to use dedicated save points in the towns or in the dungeons. I think they are quite decently placed, and they are in every town, but it's still quite annoying that you can't do it on the world map. Also, it just takes ages to load the save screen as well. But again, these are very minor issues, which I'm sure some people actually appreciate, so it's really fun. So let's now move on to another gameplay aspect. Wait a minute, where did that come from? Overworld traversal in Wild Arms has much more to it than a lot of JRPGs. It actually goes for the Legend of Zelda-like dungeons and towns. You can hold on X and enter into a sprint to cover ground quickly, which is actually needed to avoid some of the hazards within the dungeons. You can also become a drag racer and do some mad drifting. Along with that, you can use X to lift up crates and throw them around, which you can find items under, and is also sometimes needed to toggle switches. But most notably, each of the 3 characters has their own tools which must be used to solve some of the dungeon puzzles. Rudy has bombs, which can be used to blow up pathways, do worn down walls, and quickly clear away crates. Next we have the radar, not used for solving puzzles, but good for finding hidden items. It pings when there are treasures in an area. Next, roller skates. They are used to cover difficult terrain or conveyor belts that push you backwards. They can also just be used to travel quickly in a straight line without being attacked. And lastly, the power glove. Which can break objects and break down walls. With Jack, we have Hanpan, his little mouse partner, who has the ability to travel over gaps. Good for triggering out of reach switches and chests. Also good for specific chests that explode when opened. And then the lighter, used for lighting lamps in dark areas and burning down heavy grass. The grappling hook, used for crossing over chasms. And then the guitar. Another one not really for puzzle solving, using it will automatically trigger combat and needs to be used to fight some of the optional bosses. Moving on to Cecilia, and we have the Tear, an extremely plot central item which is used to open doors and trigger objects. Then the Watch, a tool which I became quite disappointed with. It is used in the plot very early on, and it shows has the ability to return objects to a previous state, similar to the TMD from Singularity. And the first time it shows you how it works, you get this impression it's going to be used quite a bit, but that proved not to be the case. For example, there's a point in the game where you're escaping from a crumbling ruin and then some treasure gets crushed by a large boulder. Now I thought I'd be very clever and use the watch to reverse so I can get the treasure, but then nothing happened. So it's really just for resetting puzzles actually. You got the wand, it allows you to talk to animals, which is needed for the plot sometimes, but can also be used to find secrets and just give some additional dialogue. And then lastly, we have the vase, which puts out fires. Now given that you're provided with all of these tools to be used for solving the puzzles, we need to take a look at the quality of said puzzles. They are quite a mixed bag. When getting a new tool, you're quite often put in a situation where you are tested with your understanding of it, which is of course a good thing, but the only issue is that they fairly often repeat and make you do the same thing an obnoxious number of times. That being said, there are moments where you can be rewarded for being observant and remembering to go back to areas once more tools are found in a kind of Metroidvania style. There are also moments where you'll be punished for not being observant enough, but this one tower, the Tri-Pillar, can really do one. You have to split your party into 3 different pathways. You have no idea what you're going to encounter on your ascent, which is of course absolutely fine. I have no problem with needing to swap between characters and making use of their various tools to ascend the tower. But that's not what happened here. Only one pathway requires a specific character, and since you get transported to a completely isolated location, you can't just pop Jack up if you choose the wrong character. Instead, you have to move everyone to this little teleporter room and then swap them around, which was an added frustration for me, since I'd moved 2 of the characters right to the top of their respective pathways, and then only found an issue when I got to the 3rd character, and so I had to backtrack the 2 characters. But despite this extremely annoying dungeon, I really like this tool mechanic. It gives the feeling of actually being a party going on an adventure, and that each member makes a contribution and has a role in the party, amplified by their specific roles in combat we discussed earlier. So now that we've discussed the gameplay, it's time to look at the world that it is happening in. Normally I would save the plot and setting for the last part of the video, but in this case I need to do a little bit of a breakdown first, purely because it's actually a case of it being very much linked to the world design. So let's get to it. The story takes place in the world of Fulgaia, a world which has undergone severe changes since the events of 1000 years ago. Back then, there was a war between the humans and the demons, who delved into the use of a lot of technology and weaponry. In order to win this war, humans developed large golems, which provide them with the necessary firepower to defeat the demons. To finally win the war, the demon leader, known as Mother, had her heart removed and split into 3 pieces to be sealed away within 3 statues. The result of the war, and all the weaponry used during it, led to the disappearance of the Euls, mystical beings highly attuned with nature and so able to develop extremely advanced technology in harmony with it, as well as the degradation of the environment of the world, rendering it barren and greenery mostly unable to grow. As a result of this, the people of Fulgaia are generally distrustful of these ancient technologies, particularly of the arms, the weapons that were used. We start as Rudy. Well, I did. You can actually choose which character to start with. We start with Rudy, a young man who likes harassing chickens and bothering horses. Rudy is a dream chaser, who in this world are people who travel across the world seeking adventure. Rudy is in possession of an arm, and when he reveals he has one while attempting to fight off a threat to the town he was staying in, he ends up being banished from the town and must continue travelling. Elsewhere, Jack, another dream chaser, is busy treasure hunting in some ruins and comes across a hologram which tells him of the existence of the Euls. He makes off to travel to Adlerhad, the heart of some of the most advanced research in the lands, to discover more information. And lastly, Cecilia, the princess of Adlerhad, she has just graduated from her training as a princess at Kirin Abbey and is due to return to the town for the festival it is hosting. Before doing so, she discovers ruins beneath the abbey, which lead her to discovering one of the guardians warning of an impending threat and tells her that she is the innocent one who will form a link with the guardians. She goes on to Adlerhad, where she will link up with the other 2 protagonists. Upon arrival at the town archaeologist Emma tells them of difficulty with excavating the nearby ruins as there has been an outbreak of monster attacks. Agreeing to assist, the party goes into the ruins and discovers one of the golems from the old wars. They excavate it to put it on display during the festival, dedicated to displaying the old relics uncovered by archaeologists, but at this festival the demons attack and steal the golem. They also get hold of the Adlerhad tear for Cecilia. We'll get into how later. I feel that that's enough explanation for the design aspect at least. We will discuss arcs and more plots later. I think that synopsis makes it pretty obvious what state the world of Fulgaia is in. It is a barren one of desolation, a world in which nature is devoid and struggling to cling to survival. And that is created very well. The majority of the world is flat plains and desert, interspersed with a few forests and very few rivers, most water being restricted to the oceans around the continents. There are also very few towns, and they're also very spread apart. Generally you'll find 1 settlement per continent, and the rest of the locations will be ruins or remnants of the old world. And this really does a good job of emulating that Wild West feeling of a sparse and dangerous world. One left with very little in it, and in which travelling it is a very lonely and isolating experience. But as good as the vibe of the world is, how do we traverse it? Wild Arms is a very good student of the 90s JRPG school of world design. Now let me quickly use this point to make a very important disclaimer. The term JRPG was recently involved with a bit of controversy, as being seen as either offensive or at the very least condescending to Japanese developers. And it's actually something I can very much see. When the 7th generation came about, Western developers got very big for their boots and believed that their shooters coated in every colour of brown were far superior to the products produced by companies that created the design fundamentals they took cues from. So I will make sure to specify that I am not being insulting by claiming it's following JRPG world design. I like JRPG world design. And what I mean by this is the game follows a pseudo-open world approach with a veiled linearity. You get access to the outside world early on, but have a very limited number of directions you can actually go. So as a result, you're essentially following a linear path, but it doesn't feel as restrictive because you actually do feel like you're traveling the open world at the same time. Despite some of the impressions I got from my Final Fantasy XIII video, I don't have a problem with linearity. It just becomes tedious when it's non-stop linearity without deviation and just moving forward in a corridor non-stop. Wild Arms handles this by firstly having the secrets and extra pathways in the dungeons as you would expect, and then also pacing out its opening of the world very well. After roughly 5 hours, you will unlock the ability to travel between some areas via the Eul temples, and then not too long after that, you'll get the ships to travel around the inner sea. Then you get the Golem, which travels across the Shallows, before opening the Outer Sea and eventually the Proto Wing and then the Gull Wing to go anywhere. I'm personally a big fan of this style of game design because of how well it paces the game. Not from a narrative point of view, but gameplay wise. By not inundating the player with multiple directions to go and subtly guiding them, the player is able to get to grips and master the core gameplay before leaving the entire world open. By the time you have the means to go anywhere, you'll be comfortable with the gameplay aspects and generally have a pretty good idea of the world layout, so it won't be overwhelming anymore. I also like the clever little trick they utilize to get around the fact that the continents actually aren't that big. They just make you move slower, so it seems like you're traveling a great distance. However, there are unfortunately one or two issues that do crop up with regards to this design, specifically when the world starts to open up. First and foremost, there isn't a great deal of guidance of where to go. While you're pretty well guided when you're stuck within the inner sea, not because you're told where to go by the narrative, but because you have limited areas to go and progression is triggered when you reach these places, this is not the case later. After roughly the first third of the game, you defeat Mother and get told to get information about the demon's activities. But where am I supposed to go to find this information? Tell me, Emma, you're so conceited and self-righteous, you'll name an entire organization after yourself, but you can't be bothered to provide the basic assistance of where I should start looking. If you're such a great archaeologist, maybe you should excavate your head out of your ass. So anyway, you now have to go back to an area you were at previously, and then enter a whirlpool. A whirlpool that when attempting to cross earlier, you couldn't. The only reason that you know you can cross it is if you return to a village close to it and speak to the mayor, who then asks to see if you can assist with dealing with the whirlpool. But the thing is, you don't know you need to speak to him, and it's not something you would necessarily think to do because it's not a new area. You would most likely have visited this village when you were trotting about the inner sea originally, and when you arrive at it, you will find that the mayor is sick and have to speak to Marielle, the large remaining Ule in Fulgaia, who helps you to cure him. So one might argue that is a bit of a clue to go back at some point, but there is two things that I can say would disagree with this. Firstly, you're supposed to be looking for demon information. Why would this bigoted twat, I'll explain why he's bigoted later, know about demons? If there was a place where I think to go for demon information, it would be Adelhard or Court Sam, the places that have been attacked by demons throughout the plot, or maybe Centaur, a place where the entire town disappeared. The second one is that the whole location kind of plays like a side quest. After the mayor is cured, you cut back to Marielle and you receive a reward, which is generally RPG shorthand for you're done here. But this is not the biggest issue. You can just travel about. And it is pretty common for games of that time to not give too much indication of the direction in which to go. Final Fantasy VII itself had the whole Temple of the Ancient part, which left you needing to figure out where to get the keystone. 6 had ambling written into the plot for the World of Ruin portion of the game. But this is where a second criticism does come in. It can be a bit difficult to make out where you are on the world map at times. This specifically comes into play when on the Outer Sea. There are times where all you can see is ocean. The map is quite zoomed in, and as a result it can be a bit difficult to get a bead of where you are exactly, as you can't really catch sight of too many landmarks or outcroppings that can help you identify your location. The game does have a map, but I wouldn't say it's overly helpful. Now this was also a slight issue in older Final Fantasies, but not as much because the camera was more zoomed out. And Final Fantasy VI would go on to simplify it more with the use of Mode 7 changing the view to a 3D light one when using the airship and riding the chocobo. And then of course Final Fantasy VII would expand on that even more. On the bright side, when you do get close to villages and towns, the area surrounding them is pretty unique for each one, and each area will also have its name painted over it when you're near it and will require you to actually press enter to physically enter the town. So the chance of you confusedly returning to the same area is pretty low. And you are also rewarded for your exploration. There are locations that only come up in walking over them, so if you're the kind of person to cover every inch of the map, this game won't let you waste your time. This extends to the dungeon and town design as well. I complained that the tool usage puzzles can be a bit repetitive, and I do stand by that. but it would be unfair to not mention that some puzzles do actually require reading and attentiveness, and actually just require a little bit of thinking outside the box, but not too difficult either, for plot purposes and extra secrets. So that's combat and world design. Let's take a look at First and foremost, let's discuss the 3D aspect, given that this game was literally given the job of advertising it. Surprisingly for the game with this remit, there actually isn't too much of it. Now this isn't necessarily a bad thing. With the increasing presence of 3D, there was a rush to use this new gimmick within every game, and sometimes it was to the detriment of the product, to be honest. A similar thing to what we saw with motion controls, but here it is dealt with well. The 3D is only used in the battles, and while it can be maybe a bit too simplistic at times, especially with the backgrounds being a bit too bare, the models aren't bad at all. The enemy models are detailed and give a pretty effective view of them. Meanwhile, the decision to use a kind of chibi style for the party gives an accurate portrayal of them, but one which also still looks good today, in an industry where most earnest attempts at realistic models inevitably age pretty horribly. It also prevents any kind of whiplash or knee-jerk when transferring from traversal from the world, as they are actually very good translations of the 2D sprites. When it comes to the 2D side, this actually looks very good. The sprites look very good, the environments are interesting, and then the cutscenes done within the 2D are very good as well. But more important than the graphical fidelity is what the fidelity is displaying. The locations that are visited are interesting and diverse. With the game set in a dead world which has mostly degenerated, it would have been very easy for MediaVision, that's the developer by the way, to fall into the trap of the majority of the game being just desert and wasteland. But there's actually a good diversity of locations that you visit. There is of course the barren wastelands, but you will also visit tundra, mountains, forests, the Sand River, and you'll even go to the Ule Dimension, which is a look of Folgai as a world not ravaged of its flora. And when it comes to the towns and dungeons, the towns feature your more run-down shanty towns, desert villages, port towns, harbours, and more developed formal towns. Similarly, the dungeons involve caves, shrines, ruins, castles, a ghost ship, sky temples, and outer realms. What's nice is the clear difference between demon areas compared to the humans and the Ules, with the metal industrial look compared to the more naturally classically constructed locations. What's also nice is the Ule teleporter locations that you visit to teleport between continents early in the game are also designed slightly differently. I realize that's a very minor thing, but they could very easily just have copy-pasted such a small aspect. So it's nice they didn't. So there really is some nice unique design, but importantly, despite the diversity, they all mesh very well together to create something. It may seem like a bit of a weird thing to focus on when you're not talking about horror, but this game's atmosphere is top-notch. The feeling of wandering in a dying, desolate world is created perfectly. The world design is a great contributor to this. As I said earlier, the towns are pretty far apart, which really does add to a feeling of the broken wilderness. But probably the biggest contributor is the music. Yes, as always, you cannot prevent me from talking about the music. In this case, it is the music you would expect to encounter in a western, especially one that would be scored by Ennio Morricone, his work having a strong influence on Michiko Naruke and her composing for the game. And it really fits perfectly with the intended vibe, really making one feel like they're in the Wild West. That's all I really have to say on the atmosphere, but I do think it is important to mention just how good it is. So that covers gameplay and the world that the gameplay takes place in, but there's a very important factor for RPGs that we now need to review. Wild Arms only has a party of 3 characters. This can be quite a gambit for a writer, since you have to make sure that these characters are engaging. Now I think it is very important to note that characters don't actually have to be likable. While it might be a good idea to make your protagonist likable, as it would genuinely encourage the players to want them to succeed, it isn't strictly necessary. But it is important that they are interesting. Fortunately, Wild Arms ticks off both boxes. Before we get onto our protagonists, we have a group of supporting characters who are also a hoot. Note, from this point of the video, there will be major spoilers for pretty much every major part of the game, so in the likelihood you do have a desire to play it for the first time, you will have the plot ruined if you proceed. The captain of the Sweet Candy, which is the ship you get to potter about in. He is a pretty minor role in terms of actual screen time, and so the screen time he does get is mostly more for a bit of comic relief. Though I kind of feel a bit bad for saying that, since he seems to be a bit of an unfortunate person. The party first meets him when he is being tormented by another member of the town over claims that he was going to get married. In his desperation, he wrangles Cecilia into pretending to be his bride. Later he helps the team with getting onto the ghost ship, and then he becomes a permanent fixture from then on. He then goes on to crash the test flight of the Proto-Wing, and immediately is rushed from his recovery to take his ship to look for the Gemini batteries. So he's a pretty unfortunate guy, but at the same time I also don't know how to feel about him given this one interaction. When he mentions that he's going to marry Cecilia, we get this response that she seems to be a little older than what he usually goes for. Cecilia is 17 years old. If she's older than what he usually goes for. But apart from that creepy aspect, he generally provides a bit of lightheartedness, which is actually very important. I'll be getting into why later. Let's move on to another character who also provides some, but something else as well. Initially, she comes across as a bit of a rival, notably being the only other character capable of using arms, before becoming a key recurring character. Her first appearance is when the party gets trapped in some kind of force field, and then she offers to help them out if they pay her. Can I quickly stop here and complain about something? This is not just a Wild Arms problem, it comes up in Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest as well, just to think of two off the top of my head. Times when the game gives you the options to make a choice, but not really. You get asked a question, but then if you say no, they just ask you the question again until you say yes. Like, why ask me then? I mean, I don't mind if your choices don't matter, like in Final Fantasy 9 when Garnet confronts her mother, and regardless of your answer is knocked out. Yeah, your choice doesn't matter, but at least the game accepts your input and works off of that. These others just feel like, incorrect answer, try again. Anyway, this exchange sets up Jane as greedy and very lacking in morals, only doing things for personal gain. A mentality which continues when your next meeting sees her striking a deal with you to get into the Volcannon Trap, one of the dungeons. She will happily get you in there for the Guardian Blade, so long as you let her have all the treasures. Compounded even further that when Rudy has to save her life, her primary concern is that the treasure was ruined when he did so. And this made her an enjoyable character alone, her general sassiness and pretty cavalier attitude making her appearances fun and lighthearted. The best probably being in the Volcannon Trap when the party is confronted by Balsalk, one of the Quarter Knights who are the 4 demon lords who work under Mother. Upon his appearance, he threatens the party and starts to power up. But then he suddenly stops powering up, and then we cut to Jane busy destroying all the orbs that give him power. And she's not destroying them because she knows it's powering him up, it's just she finds it weird that they're lighting up and it bothers her. And I really did enjoy this, the game just willing to be silly like this. Balsalk is the first Demon Lord encounter, the one who destroys Adelheid and kills Cecilia's father, or is at least vicariously responsible for his death, triggering the return of the demons and kicking off the main game. So you would expect his second encounter to be something quite intense, this moment of confronting him, but the writers were willing to make it into a bit more of a jokey encounter. And a quick shout out to Magdalene, Jane's butler. He's obviously supposed to be with her to protect her and look after her, but basically he just has to hang around and watch her do whatever she wants, and then occasionally just chip in with, well, maybe that's not a very good idea. But she also has another side. We discover later that her father runs an orphanage, and basically all the funding to keep it running comes from the treasure she manages to uncover on her travels. But despite this being a pretty clearly good thing, she's embarrassed about it. She doesn't want her father to know she's doing this, and feels it's a pretty shameful thing to be doing, in contrast to the front she shows when out adventuring. Couple this with her revealing her general feelings of hopelessness and a strong cynicism towards those who claim to be looking to save the world or restore it, and you get a fun, interesting, and well-rounded character. Probably not surprising then that they would make her able to be a permanent party member in the remake. So those two are the recurring non-party characters that are of interest. There are obviously others like Emma, but she's in particular more of a plot character. You know, the one who just exists to direct the player and assist with exposition? Important characters definitely who need to exist, but don't warrant too much discussion. But I do think it is important to quickly mention someone on the opposite side. Actually no, let's quickly talk about Hanpan first. Initially I thought that while he's a helpful tool, he doesn't feature enough to warrant a discussion as a character. But there is something I quickly want to touch on. I always become very worried when I see the anthropomorphic animal sidekick. Trepidation rises with the risk of the snarky sidekick who always has something to say. But fortunately Hanpan doesn't fall into this trap. Firstly, he doesn't really get that much dialogue, which already cuts down the chance of superfluous annoyances, but also because it is mostly dedicated to actually helpful suggestions or insights into the situation. And when he does have something else to say, it does actually offer some levity, and it shows an actual relationship and chemistry with Jack. One that's more of a friendly ribbing, rather than Jack should really just chuck this tragic rodent into the sea. So it's nice to see, but now let's move on. All the Demon Lords present themselves in a very serious manner. It's not a case of them being uninteresting and one note, but they are definitely stern and serious. Apart from maybe Lady Harkin and her sick burns. However, Zed forms a break from this in basically being dedicated to silliness. His desperation to be one of the Quarter Knights leads him to continuously placing himself in dangerous situations and overexerting himself, to often pretty humorous consequences. Especially since he's not really good at what he does. And it is nice to have, not only because it's nice to have some variation in the personalities of the villains, but again, levity is important, as I'll explain later, I promise. So Zed is great, and he has really awesome music as well. But I do think I need to get onto fulfilling that promise I've made. Wait a second. I'm already moving on to themes when I've only spoken about 4 characters and none of the protagonists. That is because in a case of good writing, the characters tie into the themes of the game, and so we'll talk about them when we talk about those themes. I've made quite a lot of comparisons to Final Fantasy in this video. I started the video talking about Final Fantasy VII, the video's title states Sony tried to make Final Fantasy VII, the thumbnail calls it Final Fantasy 6.5. Now, obviously a fair bit of this is just a jab at how Final Fantasy VII overshadowed the attention Wild Arms received, but the other part is because it does actually share themes with not only Final Fantasy VII, but 6 as well. There obviously isn't anything wrong with that, but it will inevitably lead to comparisons, and then it is up to the game to come out favourably in those comparisons. And Wild Arms does. It speaks about its themes in a smart and engaging way. First and foremost, probably the most upfront and clear theme in the game, and obviously the most clear comparison to Final Fantasy VII. But what Wild Arms does is make a very good contrast to its more successful compatriot. While Final Fantasy VII very much focuses on the degeneration and decline of the environment at the hand of the people interacting with it, it does it in situ. The planet is dying, it is not too late, and something can still be done about it. The people responsible for its demise are still around and propagating it, and those opposed to them are also still there and trying to stop them. In contrast, in the world of Wild Arms, the world is ruined. The damage is done, and there doesn't really seem to be any means to halt further decline. The other key factor to this is accountability. In the world of FF7, the people responsible are still there to be held accountable, while those of Pulgaia are not. But this also creates a different dynamic as a result. By being present, they are able to state their case on the matter as opposed to those absent. Due to this, throughout Final Fantasy VII, you will encounter differences of opinion, those who believe there isn't a threat to the planet, or that the trade-offs in the improvement of their lives outweighs the negatives. Now, a lot of this is obviously pushed by extreme propaganda, but it is still a group in dissent to the idea that the environment is being damaged. By comparison, in Wild Arms there is no argument in favour of the conditions which destroy the environment, for two reasons. Firstly, it's pretty much blatantly obvious what the impact was. There's no, well, I found a paper which disagrees with the consensus of 98% of scientists that arms have an impact on the environment. The world is red, end of discussion. But also, more importantly, the party responsible isn't present to attempt to change the perception about them. Well, they aren't present in enough numbers to actually refute the mentality against them, because there are still some left, notably Marielle. Marielle is the last remaining Ewell on Pulgaia. She lives on the outskirts of Rosetta Town, a town in which they claim to be extremely friendly, but also don't like outsiders. So basically your standard upper middle class neighbourhood. This is where Mayor McDoofus comes from. By being the last remaining Ewell, she is a link to those actions of the past, and because of that, she carries the stigma of the past with her. As a result, she is disliked and distrusted by the people of the world, and subjected to a fair bit of abuse because of it as well. Interestingly though, it isn't just an experience she has on Pulgaia. Pretty late in the plot, the party goes to the Ewell Dimension, a world that the Ewells created for themselves to live in when they left the Dying World. The Ewell Dimension is a version of Pulgaia in which the environment has not been worn away. And in this world, Marielle receives similar discrimination along with her brother Vasim. Vasim created the Guardian Blade, which ended up being responsible for a great deal of the destruction Pulgaia was subjected to. So his punishment from the Ewells is ostracization and being forced to live outside of their community. But more than this basic stigma, Marielle is also at odds with both of her worlds due to another theme. The desolation and lifelessness present in Wild Arms is not restricted to just the terrain and environment, but also extends to the thoughts and emotions to the people inhabiting it. The denizens in Pulgaia are almost completely devoid of any hope for the future. The state of the world is one of an arid, pretty lifeless landscape, is one that has become pretty much accepted as red. It is very rare to find someone who believes that there's any means by which they can reverse the damage done, or even revitalize it to form a new one, similarly lush to the previous one. Even the protagonists predominantly are fighting the demons in order to just protect the world that they have, rather than specifically fighting to create a new world. A similar attitude is shown towards the Dream Chasers. Just to clarify again what they are people who abandon living the kind of routine mundane life found in the few isolated towns, and instead travel the world in search of adventure. And while the attitude towards them isn't hostile, they are generally treated with an attitude of being a bit silly, or maybe even delusional to think that there's really anything more to be gained from the world's current state. But at the same time, there does also seem to be a bit of an appetite for that lifestyle from those left behind. And this is the conflict that is present as we travel through the world of Pulgaia. A general aversion and refusal to have hope is rubbed up against the push for hope, either with those who openly want a better world, or those who have hope but deliberately stifle it. Case in point firstly, Marielle again. She openly speaks of a desire to restore the world, an almost desperate drive to get flowers and such to grow again. She is so committed to the restoration of Pulgaia that she's willing to severely endanger her life if it aids the cause of those who she believes will be the best to aid her cause. In a pretty stark contrast, but also not really, we have Jane. We've already discussed the blasé attitude she puts forward, and how it is a cover for the actual reason she plunders treasures throughout the world, but it also covers for something else. She is one of the people of Pulgaia who not only feels pretty hopeless about the future of the world they are living in, but also shows a pretty active hostility towards those who actually want to attempt to improve it. She openly states that she cannot trust people who claim that they are looking to improve the world, viewing it as empty promises that they can't and won't really make good on. But simultaneously, she does actually hold this desire. Upon coming to realize that the party's goals are earnest and actually have a chance of success, she becomes willing to put herself at great risk to help ensure this success, which shows that there is this desire there. It just hasn't really found a reason to manifest itself. And this is where those moments of levity and humor do become important. There needs to be an actual reason to want to save the world. Quite often when plots are non-stop, dreary and depressing all the time, it leaves the viewer wondering what is actually the point of going on when everything is so bad and miserable and horrible. It is important to actually see moments of joy and wonder that actually make it seem like this existence might be worth something. And if the characters make this theme a little bit too subtle for you, let's take a look at the Guardians. The three major Guardians actively tell us that the reason for their disappearance is that the people of Fulgaia have given up hope. And this makes for an interesting perspective. These aren't otherworldly beings that preside over the inhabitants with an ethereal control over them. They are manifestations of the people. Their existence is dependent on the thoughts and beliefs of the denizens of the world. The people of Fulgaia are responsible for what it is and what it looks like. And speaking of existence, let's move us on to the other present theme. Yes, we won't get out of a video without me talking about this. The theme shared with Final Fantasy VI. Wild Arms uses a similar setting of a broken, disheveled world to examine people's place in this world. This is present with all the characters to an extent, but specifically the three main cast members. So let's get on to the first one then. Rudy shows a natural desire to protect and help those around him. There doesn't seem to really be any motivation for him doing so, he just seems to be a really good dude. But upon arriving at Court Syme, we get a little bit more insight. We discover he was orphaned as well, and looked after by Zeppet, an arms master. Not only that, but he failed to ever fit in and was ostracized from the rest of the children. As a result, he came to rely on the company and approval of Zeppet. And so, his resultant death left Rudy alone and onto a journey to seek that acceptance once more. Importantly though, his failure to fit in was not only the thing which created his feeling of being an outcast, it's also due to what he is. Rudy is a Holmcross. They are creations of the Euls who use their mastery of the blending of technology and nature to create synthetic androids, but with the organs and features of actual humans. So not only does he feel like an outsider because of his ability to wield forbidden technologies, but because he knows himself to be a creation of those same hated technologies. This would obviously make him even more attached to Zeppet, him being the only one who accepts him for what he is. But this also creates a problem for him. Having come to believe that no one else could possibly accept what he is, he isolates himself, but simultaneously is cursed for the need for approval. This reaches the point where, in a state of life-threatening injury, in need of severe surgery to remain alive, he subconsciously fights against his recovery, as in his kind of comatose state, he's allowed to remain with Zeppet in his subconscious. It requires a companion to place their life at risk for him to realize that others do actually care for him, and that he does have a place within this world. With this revealed to him, he is able to come to terms with who he is, and that it actually doesn't matter what the circumstances of his existence are, but rather what he does with it and how he treats others. Basically, the first thing that we become aware of with regards to Jack is that he is on the hunt for power. In fact, it's something he's a little bit one note on initially. He wants power and seems to be pretty desperate to have it. Though we aren't exactly 100% sure why. What we can see pretty early on is that he has a pretty strong hatred for the demons, instinctively jumping to fight Belsac upon sighting him. But we're still not sure if it's just a kind of standard hatred for him that humans have become instilled with given the past, or if there's something more to it. A similar situation to another factor which often crops up later courage. Two things which get hinted at more and more as the plot continues, particularly in interactions with one of the demon lords. He shows a weird kind of chemistry with Lady Harkin in encounters with her. She's also trained in the art of fast draw, with Jack actually learning fast draw abilities after some battles with her. And then further adding onto the mystery, we see this interaction when entering the demon lab, whereby Alazard, one of the other demon lords, describes it as a conscience rejecting the body. Until eventually the pieces do click together and we discover Lady Harkin is actually Almina. Almina and Jack, whose name is actually Garrett, were two members of the Artica Guard. The location where the demons made their reappearance due to it being the place where Mother's body was stored. During the demon attack, Almina sends Jack off and attempts to fight the demons alone. She obviously ultimately loses, and her resultant fate is to have what remains of her transport into the body of Lady Harkin and fight for those she was originally up against. And so then we can now see the reason that Jack would be seeking courage and power. His motivation to defeat the demons is spurred by revenge, rather than just a protecting and bettering of humanity. However, he soon comes to realize that the search for power and courage are contradictory. Well, at least his search for courage and power. As he seeks out power more for the reason of revenge and revenge without substance, he eventually must come to understand an actual substantive reason for his crusade. Only through coming to terms with internal uncertainty can he harness power and courage together, specifically to finally bring an end to Almina's suffering. And let's just quickly mention her fate and how it fits with the theme, and also just how generally horrible it must be if you think about it. She was the most admired and respected knight of the Artica Guard, but then her abilities were used to fight against what she originally cared about. All of this against her will, as she internally fights against it. And on the concept of acting according to the will of others, not only the name of my indie ska band, Cecilia and the Golems of Filgaia are quite intimately linked. Appropriately for the innocent one, I suppose, the Golems were created with the sole purpose of warfare, made to defeat the demons, and that's pretty much it. Being then cast aside once the task was done. But they actually do have a conscience and thought processes, displaying a tendency for free will and specifically a desire to not just be used as war machines. They don't have an opposition to fighting per se, but merely search for a reason to be doing it. They just don't want to be mere automatons, directed by others. This is shown at the end, when the Earth Golem actually is willing to sacrifice itself to protect those who did show it care and kindness, and were willing to treat it as a free-thinking autonomous being. Thoughts and feelings that Cecilia struggles with as well. For essentially the first 2/3 of the game, she is guided by a sense of duty. After being told she is the innocent one, she rushes off to where she's told to. And then when the demons attack and demand a tear, she defies her father's wishes to give it to them. Her actions guided by the belief that this is the best means by which to protect her people, and that as a princess, this is what should be the first priority guiding her actions. She herself elaborates further, specifying that all interactions have always been dictated by her role as princess and what she believes is the way she must behave according to that remit. But it also paints the way that people interact with her and treat her. But even after she tosses off the confines of this princess title, she is still restricting herself, as her decision to chase after the tear is guided by her seeking to atone for what she did by giving it up in the first place. It requires her concern for those she has met along the way, and particularly Rudy, for her to understand why she truly wants to undertake the quest that she does. But even after all of this, she's not really truly free of her princess role, as she's expected to return to Adelhard and take over the royal duties. However, she finally gets to make a choice of her own volition, giving up the throne and choosing to become a dream chaser herself. So those are just a few glimpses of how the whole world of Filgaia serves as an appropriate location to examine the reasons for our protagonists being and their place in the world. But it isn't only them who examine this aspect. I mentioned that apart from Zed, the demons are all pretty straight and serious, but that doesn't mean they aren't interesting. We have discussed Lady Harkin / Almina, but she isn't the only one. Let's start with Balsalk and Boomerang. They both share a very similar contempt for humans, believing that as demons, they are just naturally superior, and they're actually surprised that the humans present any kind of challenge in battle. And this arrogance toward humanity leads to both of their downfalls, but in different ways. Balsalk is fouled and murdered by his own people after his failure, failing by his own metric of innate strength and superiority. Boomerang, on the other hand, comes to understand that humanity is capable of greatness, and is willing to sacrifice himself to defend that notion. But definitely the two most interesting of the demons in this regard are these two form an interesting contrast with a similar partnership in Final Fantasy VII, and this serves as an ideal point for my hot take. I really don't like what has been done to Sephiroth since Final Fantasy VII took off. All his appearances since after the original game have done a lot of damage to what was originally going on with his character. In Advent Children, and Remake in particular, he plays as this kind of supreme overlord, orchestrating all the actions under some grand evil scheme. But that is not his character. He himself is being controlled. Upon realizing the circumstances of his birth, the weakness this creates in his mind allows Jenova to gain more control over him and dictate his actions. He is a victim of the overarching systems around him, be it the influence of Jenova or the actions of Shinra. But more recently, he's played as this maniacal overlord, which I don't like. But that is not the case with Siegfried, and we actually get a nice contrast here. While Sephiroth spends the plot of his game doing everything to attach to his mother, Siegfried seeks to do the opposite, and one can understand why. Mother is a very interesting specimen, in that what she wants, or what we can best determine she wants, is something that is really hard to understand, including by some of her closest affiliates. The Demon Lords are conducting their invasion of Volgaia with the view that it will become their new home, hinting at the fact they lost their old one. Now, obviously this doesn't in any way whatsoever justify them violently attacking and claiming it for themselves. You don't just get to take things because you want them. But it does give some insight into the impetus for their invasion, if they were currently without a world to live on. And then Mother speaks to give us a different perception. She openly states that she has no intention of merely keeping hold of this planet. She wants to destroy it, presumably to move on to another one and do the same to it. Something similar to Jenova, but at least the planet destruction that Jenova conducts has some kind of explanation to it. She uses the nutrients of the planet she destroys to sustain herself. But this isn't a Final Fantasy VII video, maybe I'll do that at some point. We are here to examine Mother's motives, which again are difficult to understand. We can't really see a reason why she does it. It seems like she just gets off on the death and destruction, a very Kefka-esque mentality. And so we can very much see why Siegfried might want to pull himself away from this, especially since she's quite happy to tell him to his face that she'll be consuming and murdering him as well. However, despite his intentions to dissociate himself, he is unable to distance himself from Mother, and she even goes to the extent of consuming him and using him as a vessel, bestowing upon him the same fate that he and his associates threw upon Almina. So those are the fates of those inhabiting Volgaia for the duration of our time with it. They are all victims to circumstances that restrict and impinge upon their existence, be it the action of others, their own thoughts and beliefs, or the environment and world itself. It is truly a shame what happened with the first Wild Arms. It is a pure case of hype and marketing of one product overshadowing those around that may be considered to be too similar. Wild Arms doesn't only stand out as a good game in its own right, smartly introducing mechanics from other genres into the traditional JRPG style and doing some interesting tweaks to the combat, as well as examining its themes in an interesting way. But it also forms as a nice companion to the game which knocked it into the sidelines. The different approaches to talking about the themes that they share in common makes them great companions, and I feel that's how they should be viewed. not a better game versus the inferior one, but two games which are extremely enjoyable and have something insightful to say. But we shouldn't worry too much. We would get a Wild Arms 2, and I'm sure that it would be examined on its own Oh. If you enjoyed the video, please be so kind as to like and subscribe.